tonight's event, we are joined by Oly Durose and Rhian Jones to launch Oly's book, Suburban Socialism or Barbarism, which is published by our friends at Repeater. Oly is a social activist, parliamentary researcher, and writer. In the 2019 UK general election, he stood as the Labour Party Parliamentary Candidate for Brentwood Ongar. In February 2020, he was the Caucus Site Leader for the Bernie Sanders campaign in Nevada. Rhian is a writer, critic, and broadcaster from South Wales, working on history, politics, and popular culture. She is co-editor of Red Pepper and writes for Tribune. Her books include Clampdown, Pop Culture Wars on Class and Gender, Petticoat Heroes, Gender, Culture, and Popular Protest, Triptych, 3 Studies of Manic Street Preachers' The Holy Bible, the anthology of women's music Under My Thumb, Songs That Hate Women and Women Who Love Them, and most recently, Paint Your Town Red, How Preston Took Back Control and Your Town Can Too. There's a Q&A box for you to post your questions, and there's also a chat, which I can see several people are already posting in, which is great. If you feel like tweeting about the event, we are at Houseman's Books, and we always really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I will pass over to our speakers now.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really pleased to be taking part in this launch of Oly's book. I've really enjoyed reading it. I think it's quite, before I say anything else about it, I really love the cover. I don't know if it can be seen particularly well, but yeah, particularly love the little Bernie Sanders in the pushchair. Aside from that, the content is also great. I think it's a very hopeful book. And I think we all need a bit of that at the moment. It's a book, I think, that draws optimistic lessons from recent history, even when that history has been fairly bleak, involving difficulties and defeats. I also like that it's based so much on personal experience. You've brought in people you know, people you've met as part of your political journey, and you're interested, obviously, in their lives, their opinions and experiences, which we don't often, or we don't always get in left-wing writing or books of these sorts. So that I thought was particularly good. There's a lot of praxis in the book, as well as abstract theory, which again, I think is really useful for the left right now. So let's begin with maybe just a general introductory question on how the book came about. Like, what was the background to writing it, and what was your motivation for putting your experiences down in this form?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for doing this, Rhian. It's really great to be talking with you, and thanks for calling it hopeful. I think other people have called it naive, so hopeful is a better word for that. In terms of motivation, I think, the short answer is actually just one of my friends actually said, I think it'd be cool to know what it's like to run an election. I thought I was a bit dismissive and quite skeptical at first, because I thought, who would really care? Our campaign didn't really get any media attention at all. We were in a safe Tory seat with no chance of winning. But, in turn, this kind of helped me reflect on the campaign in a way that actually may have some implications beyond my first-hand experience. And what kept coming to the front of my mind was, this phenomenon of the inevitability of defeat and what that really means. And, as I said, I stood in a place called Brentwood Ongar. It's a safe, pretty affluent suburban seat. It's been Tory since 1974, which is when it was created. And before 2019, the Tories had a 24,000 majority. We were just like a bunch of left-wing weirdos in this place. Nobody expected us to win. They were right, we did not. The Tories extended their majority, and they won by 29,000 votes. And I remember this Tory councillor coming up to me at the election count. And it's actually where the book starts. And he said, socialism will never win in a place like this. And you'll understand when you get older, he said. And, aside from the hideous condescension, the worst part was actually that I thought we'd almost given him the legitimacy to say that, through our own kind of resignation. And by resignation, I don't mean idleness. There's a fantastic, small, but incredibly dedicated team of activists. And I hope the book kind of is testament to the collective effort that it was. So it wasn't resignation in that sense, but what it was a almost psychological resignation. None of us expected to win. Nobody thought we were going to win. and we kind of, all but resigned ourselves to defeat. And so, this book really came out of a desire to embrace naivety, or hopefulness, as you say, and and say, okay, how can we turn certain defeat into radical victory, and what would this really mean? And I think the answer is, suburban socialism. And I think this is a way of building something that's grounded in our experience, but can potentially go beyond it. And I think, by suburban socialism, what I mean quite broadly is the struggle for a more collectively fulfilling future in the outskirts. And it's, on the surface, it's an experiential term. It's a way of describing our experience of running in this seat, but it's also beyond that. It's theoretical and practical, and it's kind of like a vision for socialism in the suburbs. And I think it's important to say what it isn't. It's not a blueprint. I think people, it's tempting to think of suburban socialism as, okay, what would socialism look like in the suburbs? And I do indulge in that a little bit at the end, but I don't mean it to be a blueprint at all, because this blueprint mentality, I think, is precisely the reason we don't think of what it would mean to have socialism in the suburbs, because the content of a socialist society is contingent on the way in which we struggle for it, and that's where it's fought and how it's fought. And I think I think some of us tend to confuse socialism as a broad concept for actually a particular variant, a particular urban-centric variant, and then we kind of blind to the geographical biases. And so that's why I wanted to write about what it means to struggle for socialism in the suburbs on a variety of fronts. What are the challenges, what are the potentialities? Because it's really in the particularities of that struggle that dictate what victory looks like. And I think finally, the motivation for the book was on this. I was kind of tired of the same debates about why Corbyn lost, why the Corbyn project failed. And obviously these are crucial discussions, but I thought they were being monopolized by two loud voices, one was, let's abandon radical change. It's over, get the left out kind of thing. My defeat in the suburbs is proof, they say, that, leave the suburbs to the centre ground. Otherwise, you're just enabling Tory rule. Obviously, the book tries to challenge that view quite directly. The second voice, though, I think, is that, essentially us asking, how can we change our strategy to essentially achieve the same vision? And I think that's problematic. I think, let's have a socialist vision through a new geographical lens. It isn't set by the limits set in the past. And, it's to pave a new uncharted path, effectively, which is, through the suburban terrain. And that's why I wanted to write this book.
Okay, thanks, Ollie. Naivety, accusations of naivety are an interesting one, aren't they? I mean, I was, as a teenager and a young person, I guess, I was immensely cynical and pessimistic, having grown up in the South Wales valleys under Thatcher and then under Blair, seen absolutely no change, no attention paid to post-industrial areas, not seen my kind of political traditions and political history represented anywhere in mainstream politics. My politics were almost nihilistic, for a good couple of years. And then the Corbyn project, I remember saying to a couple of friends of mine who were all around my age, we all felt like we'd regressed 20 years or something, because we were all kind of full of the sort of joy and enthusiasm that you'd associate with naive teenagers who know nothing about the world, even though I think we did know a fair bit about certainly the British political world. So it's an interesting thing to look at. I think the impact of Corbynism on various age groups, and that sense of optimism and the youthfulness associated with it is very interesting. Interesting as well that you specify this book is not a blueprint, which is something I keep telling people when I talk about the Preston model, right, and community wealth building. In my own work, like the Preston model is something, I'm sure I can put a link to the book in the chat. I won't bore people with it here, but it's something that's worked very well in Preston, and the idea of recreating it the idea of recreating it outside Preston entails, it not being the Preston model. It's going to be like the Burnley model or the Bolton model, or something. But it can be quite difficult sometimes to get people to realise that, to realise that there is scope here for them to engage and shape things from below according to their area's history, its resources, its quirks, sometimes even like its local its local personalities. So yeah, I think that idea of a particularism of socialism is interesting too. But let's go back to the suburbs for the second question. The suburbs, I have to say, are a bit of a closed book to me, because as I say, I grew up in the valleys, which is a particular topography where suburbs are not really a thing, although they are in sort of bigger Welsh cities like Cardiff or Swansea. And when I left Wales, I've always lived in major cities. I've never experienced the outskirts, unless you count canvassing in Chingford in 2019, which I did a bit of. That was an odd experience. So I think in general, my idea of suburbia is probably based on a few cultural stereotypes. I tend to think of it as overwhelmingly middle class, overwhelmingly white, and a sort of affluent, secure middle class at that, and one that exists in settled, stable family units, like the idea of moving to the suburbs to raise a family and sort of leaving the inner city debauchery behind and commuting to work, that kind of trope. I also think of the suburbs as stereotypically conservative, both in cultural terms, like conservative with a small c, and in terms of voting patterns. And my other big association with the suburbs is boredom, especially for young people. But again, I just sort of think of several songs and films where suburbia operates as a kind of shorthand for this unbearable, unexciting purgatory that you try to escape from more interesting things happening elsewhere. Whether that's to do with the suburbs primarily being residential areas without a lot of cultural or leisure spaces for young people may have something to do with it, although that may also be an outdated idea. So I'll stop offending suburbanites in the audience and hand over to you, because your book does, I think, disrupt and challenge a lot of these stereotypes. So if I can ask you to tell us about the suburbs and the reality of life there.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think you're necessarily wrong for that to come to your mind. And I think what we need to think of is a distinction, first of all, which is the suburbs, which are a vast and complex terrain. And by people's own self-reporting, apparently 80% of people live in the suburbs, versus suburbia, which is, like this particular image of a detached house, a middle-class family inside with a white picket fence, a neat lawn down a leafy cul-de-sac. And as you said, like, we might find that boring. Other people might find it relaxing, or, but either way, it's kind of this kind of staid, like kind of this same image that keeps coming up. And I don't think that image itself is complete fiction. I think it becomes fictitious when it's used to ignore the broader complexity of the suburbs, or when it's used to substantiate this idea of some universally experienced suburban haven or suburban dream. Simply put, I think the suburban terrain is enormously unequal. This is an inequality that exists between suburban spaces. You have richer suburbs, you have poorer suburbs, but also within suburban spaces. So take Brentwood Ongar, my suburban constituency. It's meant to be a very affluent constituency, that's its reputation. In the poorest ward, 30% of children live in poverty. And clearly how we talk about inequality in the suburbs depends on how we draw the boundaries around these distinct suburban spaces. But so for now, I think to keep it simple, I'll kind of just talk in terms of my suburban constituency with this reputation as wealthy, because I think then you can really challenge the stereotype at its strongest incarnation. And then maybe later we can go more into kind of like the demographics of race and class. So I think that's an entirely new thing in itself. Because what the stereotype of suburbia, I think, disguises is really like the realities of suburban capitalism. And again, I don't have time to go through all of them, but I think, the first one key stereotype that the reality of suburban capitalism really debunks is this idea of suburbia as a place of rest. And it's not a place of rest, it's a place of exploitation and gendered social reproduction. We talk about suburban affluence, but we rarely talk about the kind of labour that is exploited to generate it. Like I'm thinking of those who are forced to take low paid and insecure employment on suburban high streets, or delivery drivers, bus drivers, teaching assistants. And, it's also worth noting, I think, that anybody who spends most of their week performing the same task over and over again, 9 to 5 is denied a basic human capacity for creativity and collective care. But I think, and of course, not all labour in suburbia is paid. When people answer the door, where they rarely did, but when they did during the day, it was predominantly women. And I think this does tell us something about how one suburban stereotype is quite accurate, which is, the nuclear family kind of stereotype. But again, this shouldn't be used to substantiate this idea of place of rest. It's gendered social reproduction. The suburban family is really a deep ideological tool to justify the gendered compartmentalization of reproductive labour, the things that create and sustain life, that might otherwise be shared by society as a whole. And I think looking at the home more broadly, this is another stereotype, which is that suburbia is some ubiquitous site of home ownership. And it's not. Quite simply, social tenants, private renters, and the homeless are in suburbia, or in the suburbs. And I think we can embed this though within a broader observation, which is, private ownership in the suburbs is bad for all of us. Homeowners obviously live in a more complex position. They both benefit and suffer, I think, from forms of private ownership. One way is that, it pays to be rich. Mortgages are often cheaper than rent, and they have access to this increasingly exclusive asset. But also there are people in huge amounts of debt, especially young homeowners, who have taken advantage of these 95% mortgage policies. And I think maybe one more stereotype I can kind of debunk is this idea of suburbia as a place of tranquility and peace. So I think, AOC was asked on Instagram a couple of years ago, what does defunding the police look like? And she said, it looks like a suburb, she said. And clearly she's trying to draw attention to, the differences in policing between black and poorer neighbourhoods and white and wealthy neighbourhoods that are afforded the investment to reduce social disorder in other ways. But I think she got a couple of things wrong, which is one, which I think maybe I can expand on later because it's incredibly important, is how racial demographics have changed alongside class dynamics in the suburbs. But for now, I think it suffices to say that the suburbs are not defined by white homogeneity. They're defined by racial inequality. And I think that's a key difference because, systems of policing essentially exist in the suburbs to uphold these racial inequalities between and within suburban spaces. And even in white majority suburbs like mine, let alone the fact there are black majority suburbs, in the world and in the UK, we shouldn't think of police violence as something that exists independently or outside of these spaces, because again, the police uphold what it means for suburbia to be a white space. A good example of this is the Gypsy Roma traveller community in Brentwood, persistently terrorised and evicted by the police to uphold this idea of what it means to be white affluence. And I think all of these realities are connected. I could go on loads more, but maybe we'll move on. And, I think they demonstrate how suburban capitalism generates enormous inequalities, but at the same time, how it denies all of us a collectively fulfilling life. Because, and that doesn't really sound like a suburban dream to me. It sounds more like a suburban nightmare. Thank you.
Let's come on to demographics in a bit more detail then, and demographic change particularly, because there's been a lot talked about how the UK is demographically changing and particularly shifting populations, younger populations in one place, older populations in another, and how that's changed the political makeup or the potential political makeup of places. So what kind of changes have taken place in the suburbs recently or in recent history, and how can socialism perhaps work with these changes?
Right, so I think in the book I try and navigate different kinds of suburbanization, or rather three narratives of suburbanization, and I try and navigate how these have informed our understandings of class and race in the suburbs. And I think what I found is our understanding of suburban demographics are really quite outdated. And it's only by refreshing these assumptions that we can really ask how the suburbs can be this new coalition of for socialism. And I think, so the first narrative that's, as you alluded to in your earlier question, is this idea of middle class escapism. The suburbs are often conceptualized, as a place that pull middle class people towards them. And it's certainly true that the early suburbs in Britain and the US grew as, a result of wealthier people moving from increasingly cramped industrialized areas in the inner city. And as this migration continued, it also went alongside forms of white flight. People moving away from racially diverse inner city areas, primarily for reasons of course, racism. And, I'm sure a lot of the population in my constituency and others is to this day relatively wealthy and predominantly white. But it's against this backdrop that I think it's important to note quickly, there have been several attempts to try and define what it means to be middle class. I think middle class almost represent kind of an enigma for those of us who try and build from this basis of working class, capitalist class, relation to the means of production, those who sell their labour to survive, those who exploit working class labour as a profit off. And political parties don't simply win over the middle class. I think they exploit this ambiguity and they construct the middle class to pave their path to power. So Thatcher and Blair are both very effective at doing this, where they essentially synonymise it with aspiration. To be middle class is essentially to be an individual and to live outside of the class system. That's how they kind of constructed it. And obviously this provided the ideological basis to maintain the economic ladder that people could climb, or people thought they could climb. Obviously, aspiration tells us absolutely nothing about the social relation that determines how the middle class has acquired their wealth. The very wealth that is cited as proof of aspiration, that's the circularity of it. And it doesn't tell us anything at all about what interest they may have in upholding or upending the system in which they're implicated, which goes back to suburban capitalism I described. The second narrative of suburbanization is, tries to absorb a section of the working class into this aspirational narrative. And it's one that's become known as, working class aspiration. And I think this is almost a delayed response to something that happened in the post-war period with the creation of new towns. After the war, working class communities moved to new suburban areas that were built by the Labour government and experimented with more collective forms of living. They weren't socialist utopias by any means, but they were like at least an attempt, I think, at some form of planning. And it wasn't until the Thatcher years where this kind of collective ambition was decimated and turned into a form of individualized aspiration with the privatization of social housing, etc. And working class communities were now forced to compete against each other. And so the narrative of working class aspiration, I think, has two consequences. One of the consequences is that it divides, obviously, working class people into those who somehow deserve their fate and those who do not. And again, I think the biggest kind of consequence is that it leads to this culturally reductive notion of what it means to be working class, which I find incredibly nauseating. So, since to prove that you're aspirational, again, you have to kind of show some affluence. That's why I've got my own home, I'm aspirational. And so parties can no longer really appeal to a lack of material wealth to substantiate someone's working class identity. They will instead, what do they have? They'll say, okay, you're white and socially conservative. So this is how how culturally reductive notions of working class, I think, were fueled. And so, it's nothing about the social relation. It's nothing about whether you're exploited, it means production. If you've got a thick regional accent, you don't like migrants, then you're working class. That's how the narrative is seen to form. And so Suburbia, I think, our assumption is that it's a place of aspiration for two people, middle class and the so-called aspirational working class. And it's this idea of Suburbia that exclusively pulls people in, doesn't just fuel these lazy and cross stereotypes. It's also just untrue, because identify another kind of suburbanization, which goes back to what you were saying actually about Chingford, which is interesting, because the suburbs are increasingly home to a multiracial working class who have been pushed and displaced from urban centres. This obviously is, this is most obvious actually globally, where we look at somewhere like France and the French banlieues, which is a term that combines bannissement, which is banishment, and lure, which means place. And following repeated cycles of gentrification, it's pushed poorer West and North African migrants essentially to the outskirts. But it's important to say as well that working class displacement is hugely relevant, to areas traditionally associated with suburbia. Take Chingford and Woodford Green, which was, Winston Churchill's old seat. It was then Norman Tebbutt's, and now it's Ian Duncan Smith's, like three of the most Tory people in existence. And despite its reputation as a wealthy suburb, half of workers subsist below the living wage. And it's been characterised with this kind of displacement. Essentially, black and brown people from Walthamstow have been displaced, needing cheaper housing on the outskirts. And it's no surprise that left campaigns have done really well there. As you said, you were campaigning there. And they did, in 2017 at least, their vote share increased, I think, 3 times the national average. We didn't win, of course, just that kind of the problem. I can't even point to say this, we won here, but we did well. And I think this prompts us finally to say, what do we do with this information? We've got these coalescing and conflicting forms of suburbanisation. And they've basically produced this very complex terrain. I know that sounds like a cop-out of a conclusion, but it's just the suburbs are now very complex. And just to clarify, in the book, I don't really try and present this unified theory of working class or middle class, because firstly, I don't have the intelligence or capacity to do that. And also, I don't think it's helpful. I think, instead of striving for some precise definition, I think we should ask, what is our intention when developing a class analysis? And I think I have 2 intentions in the suburbs. One is just to ensure that suburbanites aren't excluded from culturally reductive notions of what it means to be working class. We regain a theory of class in the suburbs that's rooted in analysis of exploitation. Exploitation is a universal condition of capitalism, and it exists in the suburbs as well. And I've touched on that already, I think, with suburban capitalism. Perhaps most poignantly is, Amazon are now building warehouses in the suburbs. So let's start there with our analysis, not hearing people for a thick Essex accent. Let's actually look at people's material conditions. And the second thing I want to do is, explore the varied living conditions of the middle class, and those conditions are disguised by that very middle class label. And that's where my analysis of suburban capitalism comes in. As I said, it generates huge inequality, but denies all of us a rewarding life. And the point is to try and identify these bonds that are shaped in response to this reality of suburban capitalism, and bonds that create this possibility for a new suburban coalition that mobilizes suburban working class and also brings, quote, unlikely suburbanites into the fold.
Thanks. Yeah, that was fascinating. My very vague memories of Chingford canvassing was pretty much, as you say, like a whole host of multiracial young families, especially, who'd been pushed out from up and coming areas, areas that you would never have thought of as up and coming, like Walthamstow. Which, it's interesting to see how not just the London suburbs then, but areas that might have been regarded even as inner London in a few decades past are also shifting, and their class makeup is really radically altering in some cases. I know we'll go to questions later, but I saw there was a question on how suburban council estates sort of fit into this as well, and how I guess do they occupy a sort of liminal space in the suburbs, or are they also increasingly subject to gentrification? As I know, a lot of inner London council estates have been populations being basically displaced. So those, I think we should take a break from the UK for the next question, and come back to these questions later, because the book also talks about your experience as part of Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign in 2020. I wasn't personally as immersed in following the fortunes of the Sanders campaign as I know many on the British left were, but you were, and you actually travelled to Nevada to work on Sanders' campaign for the primaries. So can you tell us a bit about that and what that what that taught you about the varying fortunes of Sanders and Corbyn and the different moments that they were having?
For sure. So for context, we are in Las Vegas, Nevada, to campaign for Bernie Sanders to be the Democrat nominee. It's kind of like a loser's version of a lad's holiday. Like, Vegas is the weirdest place I've ever been to in my life. But he'd won in New Hampshire before, and he'd also, he technically didn't win in Iowa. Pete Buttigieg beat him into second place, but under very controversial circumstances, which I won't go into because I'll seem like a conspiracy theorist. But anyway, we won Nevada, and ultimately, just in time for Super Tuesday, though, the other candidates dropped out, rallied behind Joe Biden, and he won. So I think, the most basic similarity is that it showed signs of success, that many in the establishment didn't expect, but ultimately we didn't win. And more deeply, they were both very radical campaigns. They're both radical campaigns based on the mobilization of a truly intersectional coalition. Bernie's slogan, "Not me, us," was very, echoed Corbyn's 2017 "For the many, not the few." And both grounded in this idea of a redistribution of wealth and power, responding to growing inequality and corporate greed and ecological decline. Although I think we should say that the radicality of both campaigns are vastly overstated, both by us to try and make it seem really more radical than it is, and by those on the right to kind of scare people. Bernie, there wasn't even any mention of nationalisation at all in Bernie's campaign. And he even asked the town audience, he said, "Is guaranteeing healthcare for everybody that radical?" And the audience, replies no. And so I think it's important to add that qualification. Nevertheless, they were both, both campaigns that offered an alternative that represented, a sincere willingness to stand up to the unfettered interests of capital. And another similarity was, they mobilized a disenfranchised electorate. So Nevada, which is why it's relevant to suburban socialism, is, it's living proof of working class displacement, as a multiracial working class displacement, as I mentioned. Many of the casino workers in the center live in the outskirts, and many are Latino, and Bernie secured more than half of the Latino vote, and he also performed best with voters under $50,000, which is the lowest strata they record. Similar in 2017, where UK Labour's black and minority ethnic voting demographic went the highest in the party's history. So in different ways, they both mobilised a multiracial working class base. But what I think we can learn from the US is that the effectiveness of early organisation. So they set up an office a year before the campaign started in Nevada, in East Las Vegas, and the Las Vegas Democratic Socialists of America also do a lot of work outside of the electoral arena, especially with mutual aid. They were doing it long before the pandemic. And I think we had something similar, in community organising units that Labour helped set up. They were in very early stages, so they never really got going. And now Starmer's completely shut them down anyway. And so that's one lesson. Another is effective mobilisation. It sounds trivial, but I still remember we went to a football match where the Bernie team had organised it for the local community, and then they literally walked people to the polls after that event. I don't know if we really do something similar. I haven't really encountered many things that we do that similar in the UK. Doing these kind of community events on election day, I don't know, it's something that I found quite powerful. Having said that, a lot of this was early voting, which is the final lesson that I think we should learn from, which is, there is on Sunday was the actual caucus day, it's called, but you can vote early on several occasions. And that was pretty much the basis of Bernie's campaign. Before the election day, the turnout had already reached 2016's total because of so many people who voted early, and half of them were Bernie supporters. And I think we should have a much more concerted early vote campaign, just as much vigor as we do for the Get Out the Vote campaign on election day. What I would say though is, this is what I'm guilty of, I know as I'm saying it, but I think we should avoid a US, centric analysis of just thinking that the UK and the US left have this kind of binary relationship where we kind of just ignore the fact that hang on, the Latin American left just had astounding success. Why aren't we talking more about that? Obviously, I'm guilty of that because I only actually talk about the UK and the US in my book. But that's only because, that's the experience I have. It's not meant to be a decisive theory about let's look to the US in all occasions. And, by expanding our analysis, that's how we build suburban socialism, not just as a national concept, one that's grounded in truly global solidarities.
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, I think you're right. I found the rise of Sanders and his type of politics, that sort of unapologetic, shouty, very mild reformist redistribution, really interesting, because even that very mild sort of milquetoast kind of leftism had just been demonized in the US for decades. Like you couldn't even talk about a national health service, which is something that Britain, a very right-wing country, has managed to cling on to, without people talking about Marxist death panels, etc. So yeah, the US is very odd, and I was really stunned that Sanders made as much headway as he did. Though also saying that, I think Corbynism too was treated in this country as something wildly outside of the conventional political norms, even though it wasn't at all, which goes to demonstrate something about how ideas about politics and what's possible have shifted over the past few decades, and really relatively mild reforms are treated as implausibly radical, which I think says something about the nature of political choice and the nature of democracy. Thinking about, and I suppose this leads on to the question on what went wrong in 2019, given the potential of Corbynism and the very unexpected success that it had in the 2017 general election. Obviously, there were factors in 2019 that were systemic, things like the media, almost unprecedented, I think, onslaught on Corbyn and the distorted coverage of what his politics actually represented. There was the issue of Brexit and how that splintered both the left and the wider electorate in quite an odd number of ways. And there was Change UK, if anyone remembers them. And these issues were national, they weren't peculiar to any one area. But can I ask you, as a candidate in 2019, were there any distinctly suburban obstacles that you encountered?
Yeah, I think that's a great way for me to avoid the Brexit thing altogether. I mean,
feel free, yeah.
I mean, maybe I should, obviously, we cannot analyse the 2019 election, obviously, without looking at Brexit. And for sake of transparency, I voted Remain, and then I did, campaign for Labour policy, which was the second referendum. And I still reflect on that and think, what was the impact of that? And I don't know if I regret it as such, thinking, were there clear alternatives at the time that we could have taken that would have succeeded? However, I can certainly admit that it clearly didn't work. And there's something to be said about, 2017, we accepted the result. 2019, we didn't. It's quite a clear variable, right? And Brexit essentially created these fissures across class boundaries, which existed in the suburbs as well. And our second referendum policy simply couldn't glue them back together. Ultimately, my view is that I don't think it was a mistake to adopt a second referendum. I think we were pushed into a situation where we couldn't really have avoided it. But I think it was a mistake letting it kind of get on the table in the first place. And I think that was kind of a product of our own success in 2017, where we were now this force that could stop Brexit, which is what the majority of Labour members wanted. Unfortunately, it's not what the majority of Labour seats wanted. And this was this kind of irresolvable, I think, conflict that we never really found a way of getting around. But anyway, people have far better, more informed opinions about that and stronger opinions about that. And I think what is important to say is, regardless, we clearly can't just look at Brexit, because it's not clear that we would have won outright if it wasn't an issue, for a lot of the reasons you said, right? And in my experience, I encountered a healthy dose of what I call suburban realism, which is, this application of Mark Fisher's idea, capitalist realism. I mean, it is spoken about to death, but my friend actually introduced me not that long ago, and I thought, this guy's really cool. And then apparently people have been writing about him for ages. But anyway, it's this idea that it's impossible to imagine an alternative to capitalism. And I think this is very strong in Suburbia, at least. I learned this through debating in local hustings, which was, for many, it was impossible to imagine a world without inequality. As you say, even though the manifesto was, I think, a reconfiguration of the balance of power under capitalism, rather than abolishing it, of course, still it kind of did stand up to some of its foundations and its ideology. And I think there's this ideology that we need individualized incentives to exist, to act and to work and stuff. That's why we need wages, that's why we need pay scales and individualized resources. And there wasn't really much room to imagine a society in which we're incentivized by our collective well-being rather than, the threat of perpetual destitution or the pursuit of financial glory. And if it's impossible to imagine a life outside of capitalism, then socialism does become this kind of existential threat. And I think that's why Corbyn and Bernie were, they shifted from these harmless idiots to actually like dangers and like threats to national security, and like they must not win. And I think one particularly powerful example of this, or suburban manifestation, is inheritance tax. Because I think this captures this quite well, which is that I think it's fewer than 5% of estates of people that die are subject to inheritance tax, but 60% of people oppose any kind of inheritance tax at all. And I think that's because, it doesn't threaten your wealth now, but it threatens this imagined enriched future in which you make it. I think, inheritance is protected by a very powerful moralized sentiment, which is that it's an expression of parental love. You do it to look after your kids, so much so that almost it's a moral obligation to accumulate wealth until the day you die. This is powerful in Suburbia with the idea of the nuclear family, for example. And, it's an arrangement that equates affection with the capacity to bequeath vertically and to reproduce. And, it's almost become impossible, I think, for so many people to imagine a society in which we horizontally care for community as, for the community as a whole. I think all of this essentially boils down to the ideology of electability. There's not one word I hate more than electable. It really annoys me. And, for some, any platform that wants to confront the authority of capitalist realism or suburban realism is doomed to fail. It's unelectable, and that's obviously what Keir Starmer thinks, etc. And when people say that a left-wing platform is too radical, what they say is, they're resigning themselves to the capitalist criteria that defines the platform's popularity. So, a socialist platform is deemed unelectable precisely because capitalist structures convince us we can't live without them. And what socialists are trying to do, we're trying to break that cycle. And I think this has implications for what the left think about, or how the left think about electability, I think, because a lot of us, I think, try and say, no, the left is more electable than the centre. We're the more electable platform. And I just think that's kind of missing the point, because it's meaningless, I think, unless we're prepared to actually confront and challenge the demands of electability and say, we need to ask ourselves, how can we change the terms and conditions of electability itself? And finally, I would just say that I think what we did in 2017, but we didn't in 2019 more successfully, was we kind of mobilized this group who were fed up of capitalist realism. It was almost this break. And, we were insurgent in a way in 2017. We were kind of this shock. And maybe, I don't know, maybe as the factors that you suggest, we became stale in 2019. We almost kind of became part of the establishment in a way that we weren't before, in the eyes of the public. And again, because you get years of ridicule, to say Corbyn, and even a lack of desire of some Labour MPs, to put Corbyn in number 10. These all contributed to a much less convincing, punchy campaign. So yeah, I can't really reduce it to one factor, and I think anybody who does, is probably wrong. But that's my experience of suburban realism, and that's our challenge, which is to fight back against it.
Okay, thank you. I had a question for a bit later, which was sort of around electoralism, but I may drop it or refine it because you've answered it really well. But going forward from this point, how do you see, or what do you see as the contents of a socialist offer that can be made to the suburbs, and how can we ensure that that's as inclusive as possible, that it accommodates the maximum number of people and that it's intersectional? These issues, I'm just going to say these issues are something that I think about a lot in terms of community wealth building as well, because the idea of democratic participation and building democratic localism, it's not democratic if you're only involving the same three elderly men that turn up to every council meeting, much though I love them. Some of them are my best friends. But how do we, on the cover of the book, for example, you have a pram in the hallway. So how do we reach out to parents of new children? How do we reach out to people with no time between working in childcare, people in precarious jobs, older people, communities who are marginalised constantly? So these practical issues, I guess, in addition to the more conceptual issue of how do we interest people in socialism? How would you address that? No pressure, obviously. And like it can be a very a work in progress as an answer.
Yeah, that's actually it's a very good question that I never even thought about the practical side of, we can have these we can make this offer, but how do we make sure that like people hear it? Like those practical kind of issues, are they in? And that's something I say in the book, in Suburban Capitalism, which is, one of the reasons why nobody answered the door is firstly because a lot of people didn't like us, but the main point was that everyone's at work, or in the evening. As I said, we try and predominantly women open the door. Some of them were holding their kids, like, I don't have time to talk to you. It's like, fair enough, I'm sorry, so that is definitely challenges I haven't even thought about how we're going to get over, because it's kind of like our campaign against suburban capitalism explains why they don't want to talk to us. But that in itself is like a circular loop that you can't really get. How do we get out of that? I think what I would say is before you have any kind of suburban manifesto, and before we explain how our policies are, feasible, affordable, as I said, we need to confront the authority of capitalism that currently monopolizes all that means. And that's why in the book I speak at length in terms of suburban solidarity, strikes, protests, and mutual aid, which aim to kind of chip away at this ideology by showcasing, the emancipatory power of collective action, and showing that capitalism isn't inevitable and that socialism is workable. And I think this is a way of getting people involved into politics that might not otherwise want to or be disposed to. Because if you look at something like strikes, for example, we tend to think of strikes in a very industrial lens or industrial context, or a city centre kind of context. And so that does mean that there are obstacles to kind of suburban strikes and industrial action. Workers are more dispersed. How do we generate kind of solidarity between them? Psychologically, at least that's harder, not least logistically. But it's also like a very good opportunity to cultivate solidarities between an entirely new coalition. You saw like the International Women's Strike, and that was a very good example of how it wasn't a protest. It was a strike, because this is work that we need to get recognised. And it's similar kind of in the suburbs. These strikes that bring in new people that are kind of ostracised by quite outdated ideas of organisation. Similarly with kind of mutual aid, which was resurgent during COVID, and I saw this in Brentwood, like there's this massive explosion of mutual aid in a very Tory area, and I was like, what's going on here? And it's both good and bad, because it's great that I think people were waking up to the idea that your health is dependent on mine on yours. This idea of reciprocity, of community. We're all better off when we're all healthy. When we're all healthy and collectively. And the only problem was, though, that sometimes it did descend into how you'd expect, which is charity, hierarchical, top-down forms of help, conditional, rather than universal, unconditional kind of forms of help that mutual aid represents as a historical tradition. And in the book, I don't really offer like a decisive solution to how do we maintain this energy for mutual aid whilst bridging the gap that has been formed now between this kind of like, quite conditional form of collective action and socialism. Only other ways, we should try and link them better with unions, and make sure that we recognise again that there are working class communities in suburbia. We can accept donations, but we should stand firm to say it doesn't mean you get to decide how it's spent. And so I argue that any kind of suburban manifesto needs to emerge out of these acts of suburban solidarity, which means manifestos need to be local. I'm a big believer in local manifestos. I don't know whether they should supplement national manifestos or replace them, I'm not really sure, but local, from the ground up and emerging out of suburban solidarity. And essentially the offer is, it needs to include something about suburban workspaces. Suburban workers need to be given greater control over their hours, pay, and arrangements. That means democratizing and de-hierarchizing workplaces, giving people flexibility to work from home, and then when they can't, make sure that commuting is included in the working day to be paid. A suburban care service I talk about, providing childcare and social care free at the point of use. And it kind of builds on this article which I really liked, which was Silvia Federici's Wages Against Housework, which is this idea of literally paying people who perform reproductive labour, but not in a way that, there's an objection that says that, well, aren't you kind of preserving the gendered inequalities by because it'll be predominantly women, you're kind of just making it, institutionalising it. But what Silvia Federici says is, no, this is the first step. You recognise labour so that you can then reject it and that we can redistribute it to all of us. Another thing is socialised housing. I think we can kind of combine this idea of the personalised narrative of the suburban home within a communal setting. It kind of encourages this architectural self-expression in a community that owns the common stock. And I think finally, at the apex of any suburban manifesto should be suburban socialism, in the sense of creating new suburban settlements, which is effectively augmenting the scale and ambition of the new towns I mentioned earlier. And this is where community wealth building is absolutely essential. Democratic public ownership can bring together a far-reaching coalition of people who are disconnected from political centres, city centres, Westminster. You localise wealth and power, and you give people a sense of pride in their collective ability to share the spoils of what they produce, and pride in sharing the duties of reproductive care, giving people control over the design of their own suburbs. And I think this is probably where the naivety charge comes in. Like, how much of this is just, okay, I hope this will, mobilise enough people. But I think it at least gives us a belief that where we didn't before, where we can build a distinctly suburban campaign that is radical, that brings together a multiracial suburban coalition, as I've mentioned, defines the suburban terrain, that goes across blurred class boundaries, the social tenants, private renters, indebted mortgage owners, young people living with their parents who are annoyed their kids are living with them, insecure workers, jaded professionals, and bored workers, prospective students, precarious graduates, non-graduates, caregivers and their dependents. And it's about providing a refreshing lens through which to look at socialist demands yet again, and essentially bringing suburban homes, white picket fences and front lawns under collective control.
That's a great answer, thank you. Yeah, I would just to sort of counterpose all the great ideas that you've come up with the complete lack of vision being put forward by the Labour Party leadership at the moment, and even sections of the left that have chosen to remain within the Labour Party. It seems to me far more plausible that this sort of local path where, and it doesn't have to be a constituency Labour Party, but it can be, concentrating on forming alliances with other local groups, whether that is trade unions, trades councils, renters unions, food banks, even cooperatives, little Green New Deal campaigns. I think that there was a real missed opportunity after 2017, maybe, for things like local momentum branches that did some of this. I know there was some attempt at doing it in some places, but it didn't seem to be a strategic manoeuvre. It seemed to get subordinated to just struggles within the party bureaucracy, and then the sort of one last push of trying to get a Labour government. So I think that was a real missed opportunity. But I also think it's something that you can do outside the Labour Party as easily as you can do within it. I think, as you mentioned, the community organising units, I think it was a real a bad idea. I'll say a real bad idea to get rid of those, particularly because they weren't something that came out of Corbynism, particularly. Like Ed Miliband was hugely invested in the ideas of community wealth building. So it goes along with milquetoast social democracy as much as it does anarcho-syndicalism. But anyway, I mean, those were things that had a potential within the Labour Party at some point. Now they don't. So I guess maybe we should look outside it for developing socialism. So my last question before we go to the audience for questions is, what, perhaps predictably, what about the world beyond, or the UK beyond the suburbs? How do you see the areas like the post-industrial UK or inner London fitting in? So I think as much as the suburbs have changed, certainly post-industrial areas have as well, not only because of decades of deindustrialization and political neglect that's led to things like the collapse of the so-called Red Wall in 2019, but even areas like South Wales, where I'm from, which have stayed Labour. Like I think South Wales is basically unswingable. Like I honestly can't imagine them ever voting Tory. But nevertheless, things like shifts in the housing market, particularly after the pandemic, people moving in to work from home and find cheaper places to live, has massively shifted the social terrain of valley towns. So you get industrial communities becoming commuter towns, more or less, and the impact of that on pricing out younger people, driving prices up in general. I mean, it's interesting or indicative maybe how many of these changes revolve around housing and how fundamental access to housing has become for just to even begin attaining a standard of living that your parents might have had. So I think we have to analyse these changes in former solidly Labour areas and the political effects they might have, as much as we look at them in the suburbs. But I don't think, like, to be fair, you're not arguing that the left should give up on these areas, these former mining and manufacturing towns. I think the idea is that a strategy for them can work alongside a strategy for the suburbs. I think we really have to, not that I'm suggesting you're doing this, but getting away from the idea that it's a zero-sum game, that if we concentrate our focus on the suburbs, then that necessarily means abandoning other territories. Like, I don't think anyone would seriously suggest that. But I mean, do you see any possibility of a holistic strategy that could appeal in different areas of the UK, or that could appeal to the suburbs as much as it appeals to inner cities?
Absolutely. So as you say, that the first thing to say is, when I say we need a suburban strategy, it's absolutely not saying that we should forget any other kind of like geographical entity in the UK, obviously, especially like, city centres and stuff like that, like absolutely not. What I would say is that, and maybe you'll push back against this, I'm not sure, I don't see a huge conflict between a strategy for the so-called Red Wall and the suburbs, because I think, I don't think those are two mutually exclusive geographical entities. I think one of the drawbacks of the book is, I do, because I'm writing from a southern perspective or a southeastern perspective, and just assuming that like we can do this everywhere, like that obviously has geographical biases within it. But what I do think is, the suburbs are found across the nation. And what I would say is, I think suburban socialism is a response to the lazy wall-based narratives that the right have employed. That's not to say, obviously, like these places don't exist. It's to say that, a lot of people say that the Red Wall is to be rebuilt, and it's this, monolithic Labour fiefdom that, or it was a monolithic Labour fiefdom until Jeremy Corbyn came along, and they used it to, construct this idea of the northern white socially conservative working class voter. And on that specifically, like obviously I don't agree with that at all. We need to win in the so-called Red Wall with transformative policies, and not by pandering to socially conservative voices that somehow are used to characterize the working class in these areas. We need to stop this obsession with the flag. I think it's so insulting and degrading to assume that you can win over the northern voters with by dressing yourself in the Union Jack. And polls consistently show that voters in the so-called Red Wall seats are in favour of a radical green agenda. And that's pretty obvious why, because we need a post-industrial strategy, as you say, that ensures a just transition from deindustrialization to a radical green future. And we have all these other kind of walls, the blue wall was piped up recently, that's to be smashed in the southeast, which kind of, again, is invoked to assemble this middle class coalition now that are averse to radical change. And I think both narratives can be used in a way that ignore the real and complex material conditions of thousands of suburban voters within the red wall, within the blue wall, and beyond. And of course, that's not to say that there aren't crucial cultural differences and geographical particularities that we need to pay attention to. And not for a second would I think that I have this, as I said, it's not a blueprint. Like I don't think I'd have really much knowledge of how to win in areas like South Wales, for example. I've never even been to South Wales, which shows it's ridiculous. I've been to Wales once. And so,
I've never been to Ongar, it's fine.
Okay, it's fine. You haven't even been to the Sugar Hut in Brentwood? You should.
I'm afraid not.
Okay, you should go there once. But yeah, so I think because the suburbs are found in every corner of the nation, it is an opportunity to build a very large coalition with this strategy across the entire country, without then obviously saying no other geographical areas matter. And I think what I would say is it comes back down to this idea of what is a suburb, which I try and kind of address at the very start of the book. And I really don't think it's clear, because I think, as soon as you try and define what it is, and I don't mean in terms of what it's like to live there, I mean just in terms of where it is in relation to cities, I do think you do get down rabbit holes where it's quite difficult to define. That might be a bad thing. It kind of might say, okay, the whole purpose of suburban socialism is defeated. Or you can say that the suburbs, again, are a malleable concept that maybe have lessons beyond people's very narrow understandings of what the suburbs are. But either way, regardless, an electoral strategy needs to be radical, not just for the sake of winning, but just for the sake of it being worth standing on. As you say, I've only really known the Labour Party as a left-wing party before obviously Jeremy Corbyn left. And I should go back to your question when you say about the Labour Party. I completely sympathise with someone like Laura Pidcock, who resigned from the NEC yesterday. I think I hang on to the Labour Party because of a stubborn refusal to let go. I can't justify it. I just don't want to leave. And as I said, because I've only really known it as this kind of left-wing force for change, it's almost like it's been taken. And, as you say, I don't think that's necessarily mutually exclusive from other things you can do. And I think one thing I wish people would implore people to do is this talk of progressive alliances, for example. There are these two camps. One is that the Labour Party is the only force for change in society. Nothing else matters. But there's this other camp that tries to go deeper into the electoral architecture to find our allies, with the Lib Dems, an actively pro-austerity party, which would, further tip the balance in favour of neoliberalism. Instead, we can have maybe coalitions, but, as you say, with grassroots organisations, with trade unions, expanding this out of what it means to be a coalition, especially in the suburbs with these disenfranchised groups that need to be brought in to this radical movement for, transformative change.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't know, I'm so old that I remember Nick Clegg, when that was a progressive alliance between Labour and the Lib Dems. My whole objection to it, as you say, is that it seems to be all about the left making concessions with people to the right of them, and never centrists making concessions with people who might be, far to the left of them, not just the right wing of the Labour Party, but also anarchists, Greens, communists, because there are things. This will sound naive, but I think there are things we can agree on, even if it's something like the necessity of an urgent strategy against climate change. Which is something that has been looked at in the Green New Deal, and there are the sort of. This is going to be a convoluted metaphor. There are the planks of a plausible platform out there, I think, but it does require liberals to just give a bit. Like, this has to be an alliance is a compromise. It's a process of give and take, and it always seems to be the left who are being told to take it. Anyway, I think we should, if we're aiming to finish maybe 8:30 or something, maybe we should move to questions now. I know there's a few questions in the chat, and there's one in the Q&A, which is from Liam. Do you think that the smaller populations in suburbia diminishes the people power needed to gather socialist movements?
I don't know if I agree with the question that, you know, there are smaller populations in suburbia. Well, do you mean, it depends. If we're talking about constituencies, then they tend to have similar populations, right? But if you're right, if you're talking about like obviously a city centre the same size as a suburb, then yeah, I mean, that is a problem. And I think I touch upon it when I talk about protests in the suburbs, when I say there's two options we've got. Well, ultimately our task is to kind of shock suburbanites into thinking like, oh my God, like there are people protesting here, like what the hell? One option is to, you know, kind of try and emulate the size and scale of like metropolitan strikes, which seems a little bit, you know, unlikely. Even if we ask city activists, you know, come and lend us their support, like suburbanites lend city activists their support all the time when there's protests in the city centre. Or we can think of, you know, are there ways of having collective action that is localised, like localised forms of direct action, which really target the suburban manifestations of capitalism. So, you know, can we join striking workers on the train, you know, that can cut off basically the suburbs from the city to show that the suburbs, you know, feed the city with workers every day. As I said, you know, people engaging in reproductive labour who aren't usually invited into these kind of like these spaces. And I think that's how we can kind of get over the idea of like the size of the movement isn't the be all and end all effectively.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's another question from Steve Bennison in the chat, which is about sort of size or I guess population size again. So he asks, is there an optimum size for suburban socialism? Single neighborhood, whole town, part of a city, region, etc. I would, I'm just going to mention that this comes up a lot again with community wealth building. And again, the idea that it's not a blueprint. And that goes for size as well. Like something can, if you want to really boil it down and go with, you know, the principle of mutual aid being from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, that can be as small as a exchange between two people or an agreement between two people. So you can have mutual aid between individuals, between small groups, between neighbours or blocks of neighbours. Yeah, so I think community wealth building and democracy for me is very elastic and very flexible. Whether you can give a more perhaps a more direct answer on how you see suburban socialism working in terms of size, I don't know.
I mean, ideally, it involves every single suburbanite in the entire country, obviously. And again, I'm very keen to, it's difficult because my lens was through the Labour Party as a national movement. And I think already that limits suburban socialism in a way that I don't want it to be. I think what we should think of is as local as possible, but also as global as possible. I know that sounds paradoxical, but you know, we should start from the local level, as you say, with mutual aid. It starts with neighbourhoods. It starts with people who live next door to each other. And that's how you expand outwards to kind of global forms of solidarities. But I think what you're getting at is, the question is getting at is kind of, again, what counts as kind of like a unit. And I don't know, honestly, like it's a very, very good question. And I think it's more of a practical question, a very important one, of kind of where do you begin organising? Yeah, interesting.
So we have a question from Callum. This involves long sentences, so forgive me if I stumble slightly. What would you say to the argument that suburbs as an architecture and organisation of social space reproduce right-wing ideology, atomization, environmental waste, etc. And that therefore the left project should be a radical urbanism, which incentivizes dense urban living, promotes the repopulation, acceleration of cities away from suburbs, and even aims for the long-term dissolution of suburbs, suburban architecture. It's a pretty maximalist demand there, which I'll leave you to answer.
Oh, it's a very good question. It's kind of like the most decisive objection to the whole thing, which is basically like suburban socialism is a misnomer, which is that, you know, suburbia, as we say, is, you know, as Callum points out, the architecture does lend itself to, you know, not just right-wing ideas, but like a conservative structure, which is, yeah, the atomization of housing, car-friendly streets, which are terrible for the environment, you know, poor forms of planning, etc. And I think what I try and do, again, is I really try and lean on this distinction between suburbia and the suburbs. And I think suburbia, that is suburbia, but how we define the suburbs is up to us. Obviously, you could push back and say, by virtue of being an outskirt and like a sprawling settlement, people like George Monbiot and Peter Fraser say this, you know, we need dense plots, as Callum also says. We need denser living to save the planet, etc. And there is a room for more dense living spaces. I think I talk about the university campus as like this, like, I think we're quite romantic about communal space, university, because it's like this idea of this communal space where you had like a bar, you had your friends nearby, you had a local shop. And there is room for like this kind of like dense living spaces. But what I don't think it rules out the project of suburban socialism, where we kind of reconceptualize and reimagine our relationship to land. You know, I think it can descend into this idea of this dense plot, this idea of we need some land that just needs to be preserved, and we need humans to kind of stay away from it. Obviously, there is room for kind of rewilding and stuff. That's incredibly important, but I just don't want it to descend in this idea that humans and land should stay apart. And really, it's about, yeah, as I said, completely revolutionising how we relate to our land and having forms of common ownership in the suburbs. You know, to save the climate crisis, I don't think we need more dense living. I think we need democratic public ownership and sustainable forms of planning rather than relying on the free market. But it definitely is an important point that I have addressed in the book, at least, in reply to this idea of we need dense living. And I think it's just about really relying on this distinction between suburbia as an ideology that capitalism has monopolized and the suburbs as this new space that we can create a more collectively fulfilling future.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I'd agree. I was instantly reminded of, thinking about land use, access and ownership, how vitally important they are and how they've shaped the whole country, really, and the economy over history. There's a great book by Raymond Williams. I know I constantly, for people who haven't encountered me before, I constantly mention Raymond Williams. One of his novels called The Fight for Manod is all about, it's a very near future sci-fi, but it's about creating a new town or a new type of town in the depopulated hill farms of South Wales. But it's very much, it was written in the 70s, but it's very modern in the way that it deals with, it's basically a proto-Green New Deal. And he looks at how you can have spaced out, so not particularly dense living, but very large scale or large plan living, combined with fairly futuristic technology and renewable energy and that kind of thing. I always come back to it when thinking about what's the ideal way to live. Staying with Wales, June has asked, can we learn a thing from Mark Drakeford's success in Wales? If I hand over to Oly, I can sort of tell you that Wales does have suburbs, but not many of them. But my experience of them is that I'm not sure they're too different from how you describe English suburbs. I think one thing that Mark Drakeford has done that's been really useful is just show that a particular entity can operate while not being governed by Westminster, like the particular. For the first time, the kind of unprecedented autonomy that he showed in dealing with the pandemic was something that I think has increased support for Welsh independence, because he's kind of showed that it's possible to do progressive work within a region then. So a variant of scaling up that has worked. And the Welsh government has adopted some fairly quite radical progressive policy over things. I mean, they were the first government in the world to declare a climate emergency. Though they were basically forced to do that because there was public protest on the issue. And they've done things like the Future Generations Act, which is meant to empower local communities. I am dubious about how these things are working out in practice, but I do think they're really laudable ambitions, and they're being done at a scale that's both quite impressive because it's a country, a region, and isn't too big that it seems implausible or unsustainable. So that's my opinion of Mark Drakeford. Ollie, what is your opinion of Mark Drakeford?
I don't think I can add anything more intelligent than that. I mean, it seems to me that the left kind of point to Mark Drakeford as the radical alternative only because he's kind of compared to Keir Starmer. I don't know enough about Mark Drakeford's politics to really comment substantively, but I would like to look more at the substance of what he's been doing, because I think I'd worry to think that, yeah, let's not be hasty by saying that, Mark Drakeford's having a lot of success, he's more popular than Keir Starmer, Welsh Labour is doing far better. If all we're going on is he's not alienating the left quite as badly as Keir Starmer, I just don't know his politics. It seems, though, to suggest that from what I see from him, I saw an incredibly cute video of him playing the clarinet in his loft, whatever, which is just obviously incredibly a fresh of breath air compared to Boris Johnson, for example. But yeah, I don't really know enough about his politics. I hope he's radical, and I obviously hope Welsh Labour do well, but we'll see.
Thank you. Yeah, his optics are great. So it's as someone who's followed Welsh politics quite closely, it's really funny to see this something that has been dominated by grand personalities, mostly men, for decades and centuries, is now occupied by a man who is perhaps the greatest non-personality in Welsh political history. But no, he's great. We've got maybe this will be the final question if no one has any others. This is from Richard Millwood, who says, since 2019, I have taken the mildly hypocritical approach of doing more and more horizontal care to build reputation for Labour in our community. Is that corrupt?
Is that in the Q&A?
Yes. No, I would say it isn't. Well, I'll hand over to Ollie first.
I mean, it's not corrupt. Richard, by the way, is the chair of Brentwood Ongar Labour. And he features in the book heavily. So thanks, Richard. And as chair of Brentwood Ongar Labour, I think it's great that one thing I do say in the book, again, I kind of cop out and I say, I don't really talk about whether we need a new party or not. I say, this is what a socialist party needs to be doing to win. Obviously, it doesn't really apply to Labour at the moment. I just kind of cop out of that discussion. But I say that Labour won't win socialism won't win inside the electoral arena until it revolutionises its strategy outside the electoral arena. And so I clearly do have this link between, suburban solidarity and the electoral results of it. I don't like to think of solidarity as in an instrumental sense, that we only do it to boost the Labour Party. That's absolutely not why we should be doing it. And it's absolutely why we should resist these narratives of saying that strikes and protests will alienate populations without thinking about what longer term changes it can do to people's mindsets and exposing people to the liberatory feeling of collective action. And sometimes strikes and protests are just worth doing in themselves by, resisting oppressive structures. But, that's not to say that we shouldn't welcome electoral results that increase the electability of socialism in the electoral arena. I think what Richard has been doing, engaging in mutual aid in Brentwood a lot, and it has been proving, I hope, that there are people in the Labour Party in Brentwood who are doing mutual aid and are fighting for things I'm talking about. They're not fighting for conditional mutual aid. They're saying that everybody needs help. So it's not corrupt at all. You might be doing other corrupt things in Brentwood Ongar Labour Party, but I don't know about. But no, I think that's great. As long as I say, we fight for this form of mutual aid that's universal and unconditional. And that's how we win. That's how socialists win in Suburbia, by doing these actions. So no, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think I see there's a lot of appreciation for mutual aid and horizontal care in the chat. I mean, I think it's one of the most important building blocks that we have. I know you mentioned in the pandemic where there was just that's a very unlikely explosion of neighbourhood cells almost of mutual aid. I was the one that I was in suddenly deviated very quickly into from saying like, oh, what should we do about it? Maybe we should, meet up and have some tea. We diverted ourselves very quickly into discussing, should we requisition the local big Tesco, appropriate his food and distribute it to the elderly and ill of the community, And I thought, well, this is okay. It's not quite it's not quite crunched out, but
no, but I mean, yeah. That's what mutual aid should be doing, right? It should be mutual aid should provide kind of like a new way of living. And we can think of like community-owned kitchens as a way of upscaling mutual aid, although that language of upscaling is obviously a debate within mutual aid itself. How do you upscale, or do you try and emulate elsewhere? Like Dean Spade talks about that really well. The idea of a community-owned kitchen would instantly like increase the capacity of mutual aid within a community. Obviously, I don't know how you go about doing that to Tesco, but maybe that's in the sequel. Maybe that's chapter. I don't know. It sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just constantly amazed by people's capacity to solve problems. I mean, that's a huge part of my book, is a section called "Solving Problems from Below Without Permission from Above," because people can do that. It only remains to have a bit of faith in their ability to do it and help them put those ideas and plans into action, in my opinion. So we're coming into the last 5 minutes. If anyone's got any burning questions that they'd like to put to us, please put them in the chat. But Oly, maybe I can ask you to just give some sort of close-in thoughts for a few minutes, and then we'll finish at 8:30. Sure.
I guess maybe I'll just say, I know there'll be a lot of activists on the chat. I just want to say thanks so much for selecting me in 2019. It was an absolutely fantastic opportunity to learn from so many of you. We all went canvassing together, learned an awful lot, and I think it's absolutely admirable and inspirational that there's people in Suburbia who are resisting, and I can't thank you enough. And thanks everybody as well for all the help they've given me with the book. I couldn't have done it by myself. So it really is a collective endeavor, and I'm really grateful.
Thank you. There's a quick question from Jamie. I was actually going to ask this as well. Given that you were a candidate last time around, would you consider running again, and would you do anything differently?
I think all I say is that it's, in principle, I'd love to run on a left-wing platform for Parliament again. Unfortunately, it's not up to me. I'd say that it's up to my CLP, but the point is it's actually not anymore, because it seems as if the Labour leadership is shifting power towards the NEC for selecting candidates. And I think even if it's obvious to me that he thinks I'm some blithering idiot. So he doesn't know who I am, obviously, why would he? But, even if I managed to snake my way in, through the selection procedure, which I found it difficult, I'd have to ask myself whether it's logically possible to kind of stand on a left-wing platform whilst actively helping the Labour Party in its current form get into number 10. And that obviously gets into the whole debate whether any Labour government is better than the Tory government, blah, blah, blah. It just doesn't really make any sense at the moment unless you can kind of stand on your own platform. But again, it's very confusing. And I think it's a question of whether Labour candidates can fight on their own platforms against the Conservatives whilst also pushing back against the Labour leadership's agenda. I guess you could say that people like Jeremy Corbyn have done it for 20 years, whatever. But and I think this just goes back to your broader question of the role of the Labour Party. And as I say, I think I believe politics is an ensemble. You need to fight on multiple fronts. But yeah, I mean, if Brentwood would have me again, then yeah, sure, it'll be fantastic. But I don't know, maybe Richard wants to run this time. So yeah, or June.
Thank you. Well, shall we leave it there then? I thank you so much for doing this, Oly. I've really appreciated your answers. Thanks everyone for coming and giving us your questions. I've had a great time. I hope everyone else has too. Thank you to Housemans for putting on this event. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. I guess I'll be logging off now.
I just want to say thank you so much, Rhian, and also buy this book.
Likewise.
Paint Your Town Red, which is fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much, Rhian. Thank you so much for all your questions.
No worries.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
No worries. Cheers, Oly.